not just the explosions themselves, but we're told the entire power supply to Caracas was cut off. That's likely been done by something called a BRU-114B graphite bomb.
Right.
Is that what was used, do we think? How does that work? And would that fit
That's
the profile?
that's possible. The first time that this weapon came into use, some of you might remember back in the 1990s when we bombed Belgrade, Serbia. We were having the micro Serbia war. We used that bomb, the graphite bomb, which goes into the electrical substations, blows up over them, and shorts out the entire substation. That, of course, cuts all electrical power to whatever sector of the city you want. The entire city wasn't done, and we could see from videos that parts of the city were in operation. But if it's going to be the pathway to where you're going to up in the residencia and all these things, yeah, that would have happened. Another thing that makes you ask questions, did he have no senior staff? I mean, everyone has a chief of staff. Everyone has butlers, in these compounds. You have an intelligence staff. You have a liaison to the commander of the armed forces, pure communications to you. So the whole he was in his bed just doesn't work. Maybe he has an operations center in there where he's watching for this. And of course, everyone knows the Americans like to fly in, right? We like to fly in, do the bin Laden on you, and get out. He should have been prepared for the idea that he was going to be killed. And 30 men is not enough to protect you, right? When you're talking about a massive military force. Also, he had no idea. Did he even know that it was a raid versus an invasion? Because at my first blush, I thought, based on some of the reporting, it was an invasion where we were landing Marines because there were some misidentifications of helicopters and things like that. But in fact, it was all U.S. Special Operations and the thing we do the best, which is drop bombs on you before you even know what's going on.
And I'm interested as well in that special operations team that went in, because they were reportedly assisted by US law enforcement. They even had an FBI hostage negotiator with them, apparently, if they thought that Maduro was going to lock himself in a safe room and they'd have to get it.
Yeah.
Is that a standard composition for this sort of snatch and grab, or something they've done bespoke for Maduro? What does that tell us about how this operation was put together?
Well, every mission is bespoke, right? But this is 1989. This is Manuel Noriega being holed up in first his residencia and then going over to the Papa Nuncio, right? Where they had to blast him out with music, white noise, and negotiations over 2 weeks, right? Same scenario, drug lord, holed up, arrested, brought out. The premise of this military operation, which let no one make a mistake, when they say it was a law enforcement operation, that is just a lie. The Geneva Convention of 1949 states that a state of armed conflict exists when the first attacks are launched, even if one of the parties does not recognize they are in a state of armed conflict. So all of the rules of the Geneva Convention had to kick in. That they brought with them one DEA agent or one FBI officer to effect an arrest. I'm almost dead certain that person was not on the helicopters. You don't want to, that guy would have been on the ship that they brought you back to. The snatch requires you, every gun, right? Even if he's a well-trained, DEA has a lot of SWAT teams, FBI, same thing. You could have had a judge advocate general who was a member of the CAG, of the Delta Force, on board, who could have made sure everything was being done in accordance. But the whole premise was from the attorney general that this was not a military operation; it was a law enforcement operation where they were capturing a fugitive. It just doesn't work like that in terms of all legalities. The president had an enormous amount of requirements that he was required to do notifications. He refused to do them. Didn't notify Congress, didn't notify House, Senate, Intelligence committees, just did him on his own whim after setting this operation up. But he did notify the oil companies, which is interesting that they would be getting their assets back. So, mission going in, battling, killing the final bodyguards around them, which is relatively easy, right? And then him already to walk out to a helicopter. Any other circumstance, you would have to blast him out. You would have been on the ground for hours. So interesting that you say a hostage negotiator. They're not negotiating. They would have blown the place to pieces.
Well, and as we mentioned before, along with that Sentinel drone, which had been tracking Majuro for some time, there's also apparently been that CIA team tracking Majuro since roughly August, it's being reported.
Right.
That's something you yourself pointed out in a previous episode of the Trump Report, I should add. I think probably in September or maybe August.
Yeah.
Just give us an idea then, as you were earlier, what that team might have been getting up to. How do you track Nicolas Maduro for such a long amount of time?
Well, first off, he's the principal of the country, so it's not hard to track him. He's got a schedule, right? He's got a social secretary and a chief of staff and a who has a resource listing for all the vehicles that have to go out, the fuel allocations. There's an enormous amount of intelligence that goes into moving a VVIP from point A to point B. So the Central Intelligence Agency, not just them, plus the Joint Special Operations Command, have numerous resources that they first is using case officers to go down there and buy the loyalty or work the loyalties of people who know the most about this. We could have used other resources and assets. Other countries have agents and assets that can report to us through our third parties. Like, you never know. An Ecuadorian intelligence officer could be running a guy who's inside the residencia, and he, for the low amount of $50 million, will give you that little bit of information, and then you pick it up. CIA officers on the ground there, or more importantly, paramilitary officers who would be the spearheads and the pathfinders for the U.S. military, and they work together quite easily. So that you would put into place, and what you would do is you just watch the building. You pay the little old lady who's selling, empanadas out front, to let you know when Maduro come by here every day, and then you start infusing this with space-based resources, right? Satellites, drone-based resources like the RQ-170, which is a very high altitude, high flying drone, and other drones that are generally not talked about. So these are relatively easy things when you're talking about a VVIP. Also, he had just met the Chinese delegation 3 or 4 hours before, which gave you a fixed final location. That fixed final location, you can vector off of that. Did the residencia? Leave his wife there and then go off in a Jeep to go see his mistress. All of these things, right? These, his movement, his pattern of life is what we would call that. And as a VVIP, he's got people he invites over for dinner, right? So if his favorite, politician comes over, the vice president comes over, they also have a network of communications around them, right? And that'll be in Spanish language, in which security vehicles will talk, the telephone calls from the vice president, whatever. This This is just not outside of our realm of copying, as we say in my world, right? And that will tell you the truth. Same thing with his own phone. We don't know if we had access to his phone. I have this saying, right? The president, a VVIP always lies to his wife, never lies to his mistress. So if he knew something was really coming, he'd be telling his boo boo to go get the kids or get your your stripper clothes and take a suitcase and go over to the holiday, the Intercontinental, you or go to Colombia. That's real. It's not a joke, and then of course he leaves the fat wife behind. So this is multiple layers. When you're talking about an operation that is focused on a single individual or a terminus, or one single place, we can put an enormous amount of national and international resources into it. Now that was done. The key question is, there's this poem by Rudyard Kipling about I have six faithful serving men, which is who, what, when, where, why, right? Those are the keys to intelligence. But the key word is always why. Why did we do it this way? The terminal effect of removing Nicolas Maduro and his wife only, right? Killing his Cuban bodyguards. Why? What was the effect that you expected? Did Maduro negotiate his own self out? Did Maduro, why? Then did the opposition, as the opposition says, it was a negotiated exit? Was the Minister of Defense the opposition? Right? Because this looks closer to a soft coup, where usually when there's turmoil, where there's a change of regime, there's gunfire, bank robberies, crime goes out the window, law goes world without rule of law goes into effect.